Now that we've gone through and built a basic qualitative growth model, you should have something that looks like this: a very simple, whiteboardable representation about how your product grows using the foundational elements of loops rather than funnels. Now, this was the LinkedIn free product example that we went through, as well as the New Relic B2B product example that we went through. The goal with these qualitative growth models, once again, is to have a tool that's really easy to communicate, that aligns the team understanding and language about how the product grows, as well as help identify and evaluate the strategic picture. What we want to talk about now are 3 variations of the qualitative growth model in other important factors: double loops, split models, as well as current and future qualitative growth models. The first one is about double loops. Sometimes when you build out these qualitative growth models, you'll find that you have the same loop in your acquisition layer as well as the habit layer. So in the LinkedIn free product example, we have the build your network viral loop, both as an acquisition loop, both as a habit loop. We have this because if a user invites another user, that could end up being a retention loop if that receiving user is already on the LinkedIn platform, but also an acquisition mechanism if that user is not on the platform. The key point about this is when you find these, what we would call double loops, they're incredibly powerful focal points. That's because every improvement that you make to these loops not only improves the retention side of this loop, but also the acquisition side. So when you find these double loops, they tend to be the number one area that you can focus on to drive additional growth in your business. The second variation of a qualitative growth model that we want to talk about are split models. Many of you will need to build 2 different qualitative growth models. Just certain different types of companies, depending on their business model and product, need multiple qualitative models to represent the full picture about how their product grows. The first and most obvious would be marketplaces. Marketplaces need to build 2 different models, one for supply and one for demand. So if we looked at Airbnb as an example, they would have one qualitative growth model that would represent how the host side of their business grows. Here you can see that we have acquisition loops, both as paid as well as a get incentivized viral loop, as well as habit loops around the messages and reviews, as well as new bookings. But just as we've built out a qualitative representation about how we grow the host side of our business, we also need to think about, well, how do we grow the other side of the business, which is guests? And as you can see here, we have a different set of acquisition and habit loops because there are different mechanisms that acquire and retain the guest side of the marketplace versus the host side of the marketplace. The second type of business where you'll need multiple models are ones that are ad-based businesses. So in the LinkedIn, or if we were to build out a qualitative growth model for something like Facebook, we would have a qualitative growth model that talks about how do we grow the user side of the business, but we would also need one around how do we grow the advertiser side of the business, since that's really important to building a sustainable business over time. The third type of qualitative growth model where we might need multiple different models to represent the full picture of the business are companies that are mature enough to have multiple products. That would be something like Salesforce or HubSpot, where they have a whole line of products that serve different needs. We would want to build a qualitative growth model individual to the product rather than trying to represent it all as one model, which would end up being too complicated. The third variation of a qualitative growth model is thinking about where we're at now with our product and how our product grows now, but also where do we want it to go in the future. So one thing that we encourage after you build the qualitative growth model around how your product grows now is build a second version that highlights the future areas of opportunity for growth. So you can see here in the blue, we have our current acquisition loops as well as habit loops and linear activities, but we might also want to layer on in terms of, for communication reasons, around informing the team of where we want to grow are what are the future acquisition loops and the future habit loops that we want to build so that we can build a full picture of how we're going to develop and evolve our growth strategy over time. So a quick recap on this. One is that when you find double loops within your qualitative growth model, it helps identify an incredibly high point of leverage. So you should start by focusing there. The second is that a lot of different types of companies and products require multiple qualitative growth models in order to represent how their business grows. Things like marketplaces, ad-based businesses, and multi-product companies. And third is to communicate an evolving strategy over time. Create a qualitative growth model that has both how you grow today, but also highlights how do you grow in the future. In the next section, we're going to take this qualitative growth model and identify specific loops within the qualitative growth model that we want to build the quantitative representation